Say again, Hammer Actual. We're taking fire. The radio exploded. It didn't just crackle with static. It erupted with the deafening, chaotic roar of a sustained firefight. But before I continue, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, comment below, and tell me where you're watching from. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Then came the screaming. Raw, panicked, and human. Then, absolute nothingness. Sergeant Alex Carter froze, his body rigid against the crumbling plaster of a ruined wall. The heavy military receiver still pressed so hard against his ear that the plastic dug into his skin. His breath caught in his throat. The air in the alleyway was thick with the smell of pulverized concrete, copper blood, and burning cordite, but in that single second, Carter couldn't smell or feel any of it. He was entirely consumed by the dead air in his headset. 6 men in his squad crouched in the rubble around him. 6 pairs of eyes, wide and white in the gathering dusk, stared directly at their sergeant. They were waiting. They were hoping, praying to whatever God watched over this godforsaken city, that Carter would lower the radio and say it wasn't what it sounded like. They wanted him to say it was just a communications glitch, a loss of signal. But Carter already knew the truth. The rescue team they had just called in, a heavily armed quick reaction force known as Hammer Team, had just been wiped out. And whatever had just slaughtered them in the streets a few blocks away was coming for Bravo Squad next. The mission was supposed to be simple. If there was ever such a thing in war, Bravo Squad had been inserted into the outer edge of the city just before sunset. 6 American soldiers. 1 objective. Command had received fragmented intelligence reporting that a faction of enemy fighters was using an abandoned, bombed-out industrial district as a staging ground. Bravo's job was to walk in, confirm the presence of the staging ground, paint the targets, and walk out. In and out. Quiet. Fast. No contact expected. That was the plan briefed to them in a sterile, air-conditioned tent 20 miles away. But plans drawn on dry erase boards rarely survive first contact with the dirt, the shadows, and the reality of a ruined city. Their first mistake was trusting the silence. They had entered through the western edge of the district, moving in a staggered column. The streets were empty, save for the rusted husks of civilian vehicles and the mountains of debris, pushed to the sides of the road by ancient bulldozer treads. The buildings around them were jagged silhouettes against the fading orange sky. There was no movement. Not a stray dog, not a rat, not a curtain fluttering in the wind. It was too quiet. Carter had felt it immediately. It was a physical pressure in the center of his chest, a heavy, sinking feeling that only came from years of surviving places just like this. The primal part of his brain, the part that kept him alive through 3 previous deployments, was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. "Stay sharp," Carter had whispered into his boom mic, his eyes scanning the hollow, black windows of the apartments above them. "Keep your spacing. Watch your sectors." The squad moved deeper into the labyrinth of concrete. Jenkins took point, his rifle sweeping the shadows. Lewis covered the rear, the heavy barrel of his saw sweeping back and forth. They checked every corner. They watched the rooftops. They listened for the telltale crunch of glass or the subtle, high-pitched hum of enemy surveillance drones in the clouds. But there was nothing. Then, a single shot echoed through the street. It was a sharp, piercing crack that snapped past Carter's ear with the velocity of a supersonic wasp. Everything exploded at once. The silence of the dead city was instantly shattered by the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. It didn't come from one direction. It came from the windows on their left. It came from the rooftops on their right. It came from the shadows of the alleyways ahead of them. Muzzle flashes flickered like deadly strobe lights in the darkening ruins. "Contact front. Contact left." Jenkins screamed, Dropping to one knee and returning fire, the squad dove for cover as a storm of bullets ripped through the street, tearing chunks of asphalt into the air and sparking off the rusted cars. Private Lewis went down immediately. He didn't cry out. The heavy caliber round caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around before dropping him onto the broken pavement like a puppet with its strings cut. Man down. Miller yelled, his voice cracking with panic. Lewis is hit. Carter didn't think. Instinct took over. He dropped his rifle to its sling, sprinted across 3 yards of open ground while rounds snapped at his heels, and grabbed Lewis by the drag handle on the back of his tactical vest. With a guttural yell, Carter hauled the heavy gunner backward, sliding him behind the solid mass of a concrete barrier, just as a line of bullets chewed up the ground where Lewis had been lying a second before. Carter rolled Lewis onto his back. The blood was spreading fast. Too fast. It was pooling in the collar of his uniform, dark and slick in the fading light. "I got you, buddy. I got you," Carter lied, pressing his hands hard against the wound. "We're surrounded, Sarge." Hayes shouted from behind the husk of a sedan, firing short, controlled bursts into the upper windows. "They've got our flanks pinned." Carter let go of Lewis's wound with one hand and ripped the radio receiver from his vest. "Command, this is Bravo Squad. Troops in contact. We have multiple hostiles, elevated positions. I have one man down, critical. Request immediate QRF. We need Hammer team now." For a terrifying second, it was only static. Asterisk then, a voice cut through the noise. Crisp, calm, and professional. "Bravo. This is Hammer Team Actual. We monitor your situation. We are mounted and 5 minutes out from your grid. Hold your position, Bravo. We're bringing the heavy guns." Relief hit the squad like a physical wave. Carter relayed the message. 5 minutes. It sounded like an eternity in a firefight, but it was a number. It was a lifeline. They just had to survive for 300 seconds. But holding the line was proving impossible. The firefight didn't slow down. If anything, the intensity doubled. The enemy fighters weren't just spraying and praying. They were pressing closer. They were bounding from cover to cover, using the geometry of the street to their advantage. More shots. More movement. Carter leaned out, firing controlled bursts at a shadow shifting behind a pile of rubble. "Keep them back. Do not let them cross the street." He looked down at Lewis. The private wasn't moving anymore. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the darkening sky, the chaotic flashes of gunfire reflecting in his pupils. There was no time to process the grief, no time to close his eyes, no time to think about the fact that Lewis was 22 years old and had a fiancé waiting in Texas. There was only time to survive. 3 minutes passed, then 4. The squad was burning through their ammunition at a terrifying rate. Carter grabbed the radio again, shouting over the deafening roar of Jenkins suppressing fire. "Hammer, status? We are black on ammo and taking heavy fire. Where are you?" The reply from Hammer Actual came instantly, clear over the net. "We just crossed the bridge, Bravo. We are approaching your position now. We're 1 block east." Popping smoke in 10. And then it happened. Gunfire erupted. But it wasn't coming from the street around Carter. It was coming from the tiny speaker of the radio in his hand. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was the sound of a heavily armored convoy, driving straight into a brick wall of high explosives and armor-piercing rounds. "Contact left." "LEFT," a voice screamed over the radio. It wasn't the calm voice of Hammer Actual anymore. It was a voice filled with raw, unadulterated terror. "Get down. Get the 50 up. Suppress that roof." A massive explosion rattled the speaker, forcing Carter to flinch. Screaming filled the channel. Carter's grip tightened on the receiver until his knuckles turned white. Hammer, say again. What's your status, Hammer? The transmission cut into pure, agonizing chaos. The rhythmic, heavy thud of an American .50 caliber machine gun was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming chatter of dozens of enemy automatic weapons. Men were shouting in the background, screaming for medics. Screaming in pain. Then, Hammer Actual's voice came over the net one final time. He was coughing, his voice wet and broken. Bravo. It's a trap. They were waiting. They knew we were. Silence. A heavy, absolute, mechanical silence settled over the radio channel. No one in Bravo Squad spoke. Even the enemy fire around them seemed to lull for a brief second. The squad had heard the radio chatter. They didn't need Carter to explain it. They all understood the horrific reality of what had just occurred 2 blocks away. Hammer Team hadn't just been attacked. They hadn't stumbled into a random patrol. They had been led into a slaughterhouse. Carter lowered the radio slowly, the plastic slipping through his sweaty fingers. He looked at his men. They're gone. Private Jenkins shook his head, his face pale beneath the streaks of dirt and gunpowder. No, Sarge. They were 5 minutes out. They had armor. They can't just be gone. Carter didn't answer. He looked at the streets around them. He looked at the perfect angles of fire the enemy had established. He looked at the way the ambush had been sprung simultaneously from 3 different elevations. He looked at the way the enemy had pinned them in this exact spot, preventing them from moving forward or backward, but not overrunning them. They had been kept alive just long enough to scream for help. They knew we were here, Carter whispered, the realization settling into his bones like ice. The gunfire resumed. But it was different now. It was closer, more aggressive. The enemy wasn't rushing. They were tightening the circle. They were moving with the cold, methodical precision of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. Because they did. Hammer Team was dead. No one else was coming. Carter's mind raced, cycling through variables at a frantic pace. How did they know? Their insertion position wasn't supposed to be compromised. They had walked 5 miles through the dark to avoid detection. Their route was secure. Their communications were heavily encrypted using rotating frequencies. There was only one way. The enemy could have timed the ambush so perfectly. There was only one way they could have known exactly which street Hammer Team would take to rescue them. Someone was listening. We can't stay here, Carter said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into absolute command mode. Jenkins looked at him, wiping a mixture of sweat and dust from his eyes. And go where, Sarge? They've got the main road locked down. If we step out from behind this concrete, we're shredded. Carter pointed east, toward a narrow gap between 2 crumbling apartment buildings. Alleyways. Less exposure. We move through the interior walls. We make our own doors if we have to. And if they're waiting in the alleys? Hayes asked, his hands shaking as he loaded his second-to-last magazine. Carter didn't hesitate. He looked his soldier dead in the eye. They are. Silence fell over the small group of survivors. The enemy fire chipped away at the concrete above their heads, sending a dusting of white powder over their shoulders. Then Carter said the only thing that mattered. But staying here gets us killed for sure. On my mark. Smoke out. Jenkins pulled a smoke grenade from his webbing, pulled the pin, and hurled it into the center of the street. Thick, acrid white smoke billowed outward instantly, creating a temporary, fragile wall between them and the enemy guns. Move! Move! Carter roared. The squad ran. They abandoned Lewis's body. It was the hardest thing a soldier could do, but carrying a corpse would mean adding 5 more to the pile. Bullets chased them through the smoke, snapping the air around their heads and tearing into the brickwork beside them. One wrong step, one trip over a piece of rebar, and you were dead. They pushed through the narrow alley, the walls closing in on them. They jumped over piles of rotting debris, cut through the ground floors of broken buildings, boots crunching on decades of shattered glass. They were always moving, always hunted. The sound of pursuit was right behind them, shouts in a foreign language, the clatter of gear, the relentless cracking of rifles. They huddled in the darkness of a collapsed bakery, their chests heaving, lungs burning for oxygen. Then, the radio clipped to Carter's vest crackled to life again. "Bravo Squad, this is command. Do you copy? We have lost contact with Hammer Team. Be advised, we are spinning up a new QRF. Airborne assets are en route to your grid." 2 minutes out. Carter stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face. "No," he whispered. Jenkins looked at him in the dark. "What? Sarge, that's air support. That's our ticket out of here." Carter grabbed the radio, his thumb pressing the transmit button with desperate force. "Command, this is Bravo. Abort QRF. I repeat, abort all QRF assets. Do not send them." "Negative, Bravo," Command replied, confusion lacing the officer's voice. "You are heavily outnumbered. They are 2 minutes out. Mark your target area with IR strobes." Carter's voice hardened into a vicious growl. "Abort IT? Pull them back right now? God damn it." A heavy silence fell over the radio net. In the tactical operations center miles away, Carter knew a room full of officers were staring at a speaker, wondering if their sergeant on the ground had finally lost his mind. "Bravo Actual. Confirm reason for abort," Command demanded. Carter looked around the ruined interior of the bakery. He looked out the shattered front window at the empty, silent rooftops. The enemy had stopped shooting. They had stopped chasing them. They were waiting again. "Asterisk, they're listening to us," Carter said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and horror. Command didn't respond immediately. The implications of that statement were catastrophic. Then, "Explain, Bravo." Carter spoke fast, keeping his voice to a harsh whisper. "They hit Hammer Team before Hammer even reached our block. It was a perfect ambush, an engineered kill zone. Hammer had no chance. That wasn't a coincidence. That was planned. They knew where Hammer was coming from, and they knew exactly when to strike. If you send in those birds, they are flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Call them off." Silence hung on the net for what felt like an hour. Then Command replied quietly, "Stand by, Bravo." Seconds ticked past. The squad sat in the dark, the sweat cooling on their skin, turning the dust into mud on their faces. The enemy was out there, waiting for the sound of helicopter rotors, waiting for the next batch of victims. Then, a new voice came over the radio. It wasn't the stressed, authoritative voice of the combat commander. It was calm, controlled, clinical. "Bravo Squad, this is Signals Intelligence." Carter closed his eyes briefly. The dread in his stomach was solidifying into a block of lead. "We are detecting unauthorized access to your communications net," Signals said softly. "There it is." Carter whispered to himself. Signals wasn't finished. And the next words they spoke tore Bravo Squad apart, faster than any bullet could. "Bravo, the leak isn't external. No one cracked the encryption from the outside. The broadcast is coming from inside your perimeter. It's coming from your unit. Everything stopped. No one moved. No one breathed. The ambient noise of the burning city seemed to fade away. 6 soldiers had walked into this district. 1 was dead in the street. 5 were sitting in this dark room, and 1 of them was feeding the enemy every word, every coordinate, every breath they took. Jenkins was the first to speak, his voice a frail, trembling whisper. That's not possible. Sarge, tell them that's not possible. We're Americans. We're Bravo. Carter didn't answer command. He slowly turned away from the window, looking at the 4 men huddled in the shadows. He looked at each man. He looked at their faces, masked by dirt and fear. He looked at their weapons, gripped tightly in their hands. He looked into their eyes. These were men he had eaten with, bled with, laughed with. Men whose families he had met. And one of them had just gotten a dozen good men in Hammer Team slaughtered. "Drop your radios," Carter ordered. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was cold, dead, and absolute. No one argued. The realization of what was happening had paralyzed them. One by one, hands reached up to their tactical vests. Velcro ripped. Plastic clicked. 4 radios hit the concrete floor. Carter unclipped his own and dropped it next to the pile. The silence in the room now felt heavier, more dangerous than the gunfire outside. The threat wasn't just out in the dark anymore. It was breathing the same air as them. Asterisk. Jenkins spoke again, taking a slow step back from the group, his eyes darting frantically between his squadmates. "Sergeant, what are we doing?" Carter didn't look away from the men. His hand slowly drifted down to rest on the grip of the sidearm, holstered on his thigh. "We find out who it is. Because if they didn't, none of them were making it out of this city alive. The enemy wouldn't let them leave. They were too valuable as bait. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Gunfire echoed again in the distance. The enemy was getting restless. They were still searching, still closing the net. Time was running out. Carter pointed to the center of the room. "One of you talks. Now, you tell me how they're listening. You tell me why." No one moved. No one spoke. Miller stared at the floor, shaking his head slowly in denial. Hayes looked like he was about to be sick. Then, Private Cole shifted his weight. He stepped forward slightly, raising his hands in a defensive, nervous gesture. "I didn't do anything, Sarge. I swear to God, I didn't do anything." Carter's eyes locked onto him, the gaze of a predator finding its mark. No one had accused Cole. Not yet. "Then why'd you step forward, Cole?" Carter asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Cole froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths. Carter took a step toward the pile of radios on the floor. He knelt, his eyes never leaving Cole. He picked up Cole's radio. It looked standard issue. Black plastic, heavy battery, thick antenna. But as Carter turned it over in his hands, he saw it. The casing on the back battery panel was slightly loose. Carter dug his thumbnail into the crack and pried the plastic cover off. Hidden beneath the battery, spliced perfectly into the wiring harness, was a tiny secondary circuit board. It had a small, blinking green light. It was a secondary signal transmitter. It wasn't standard issue. It wasn't American. It was a constant, open microphone broadcasting on an unencrypted local frequency. Carter stood up slowly. He held the exposed radio out in the palm of his hand. The blinking green light illuminated the dust floating in the dark room. He looked at Cole. "Where'd you get this?" Carter asked. Cole's voice cracked, tears suddenly spilling over his dirt-caked cheeks. "Sarge, I didn't." "Where?" Carter roared, the sheer volume of his voice making the other men flinch. He drew his pistol and pointed it directly at Cole's chest. "You tell me right now, or I swear to God I will leave you in this room for them to find." Silence. Then the truth came out, spilling from Cole's lips in a broken, pathetic sob. "They grabbed me last week," Cole wept, falling to his knees, his hands covering his face. "When we were on leave in the capital. 2 men. They shoved me into a van. They had pictures, Sarge. Everything stopped. The war outside ceased to matter. They had pictures of my brother." Cole sobbed, his body rocking back and forth on the concrete. He's stationed at the embassy. They knew his schedule. They knew where his quarters were. They gave me the radio. They said if I didn't swap it out, they said they'd kill him. They'd send him home in pieces. I didn't know they were going to do this. I thought they just wanted to listen. I didn't know. No one spoke, because now they understood. Everything made horrific sense. A perfect ambush. The enemy exactly where to wait. The slaughter of Hammer Team. The entire operation had been built around the fact that the enemy had a wire directly into Bravo Squad's command net. Cole had been feeding them positions. Every time Carter called out a phase line, every time he called for support, he was giving the enemy the playbook. It wasn't by choice. Cole was a victim of extortion. A pawn. But looking at the blinking green light, looking at the blood on his own hands, from where he had tried to hold Lewis's life inside his body, Carter knew that the reason didn't change the result. Carter looked down at the weeping private. His eyes were devoid of pity, devoid of sympathy. "You got good men killed, Cole," Carter said quietly. Cole's eyes filled with fresh tears as he looked up at his sergeant. "I didn't have a choice, Sarge. Please, you have to understand. I didn't have a choice." Carter's voice was as cold as the grave. "You always have a choice, Cole. You just made the wrong one." Carter turned his back on the boy. He looked at Jenkins, Miller, and Hayes. They were staring at Cole with a mixture of disgust and absolute heartbreak. The bond of the squad was shattered, ground into the dust on the floor. Gunfire returned outside. It was closer than ever. The enemy was sweeping the buildings. They had realized the broadcast had stopped. They were coming to finish the job manually. Carter made the call. "We move. Now. Suppressed weapons only. We break out through the northern sewers." Carter threw the compromised radio onto the floor. He raised his boot and stomped down, crushing the circuit board, extinguishing the blinking green light forever. They left the radio behind. They left the signal. They left the betrayal. They fought their way out of the city. It was a brutal, ugly, desperate retreat in the dark. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It was a desperate scramble for survival. They fought with knives, with the last of their ammunition, with their bare hands in the dark tunnels, beneath the streets. 4 of them made it back to friendly lines. 2, DIDN single quotes T. Lewis had died in the street during the first volley. And Cole never made it out of the bakery. When the enemy breached the room 5 minutes after Bravo left, they found the traitor sitting on the floor in the dark, his weapon untouched beside him. Whether the enemy killed him, or he had stayed behind to buy them time, Carter never asked. And he never cared. Back at the forward operating base, 72 hours later, Carter sat alone in a dimly lit debriefing tent. The base was bustling outside. Men were loading helicopters, preparing for a massive retaliatory strike on the district. But inside the tent, there was only the sound of a cassette tape winding backward. Carter sat with his head in his hands, staring at a small audio player on the metal folding table. He pressed play. The tape hissed. Then came the sound of the firefight. The sound of Hammer Team dying. Contact left. Get down. Get down. Suppress that. Explosions. Screaming. And then that final desperate voice of Hammer Actual. A man Carter had known for 6 years. Bravo. It's a trap. Carter reached out and turned the machine off. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with ghosts. He knew he would never be able to scrub the sound from his mind, because some sounds, some betrayals, don't leave you. They follow you home, ever.